You actually think you deserve to be paid full price for that garbage you call work?
Lauren Whitmore's voice cut across the main lobby of Sterling Tower, like a blade sharp enough that every nearby employee stopped moving. She stood in the center of the floor, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Ryan Cole, with the kind of contempt usually reserved for something scraped off a shoe. Ryan had just handed her the completed invoice, every floor cleaned, every surface, finished, every deadline met. Lauren took one look at it and slashed the payment by more than half. Ryan said nothing. He folded the invoice, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and walked out. 2 weeks later, Sterling Tower was in a crisis nobody saw coming. Ryan Cole had built his reputation the slow way, one job at a time, one handshake at a time, in a city that didn't hand anything to anyone who couldn't prove themselves first. He was 38 years old, and if you passed him on the street, you wouldn't look twice. Medium height, worn boots, a jacket that had seen too many early mornings. He drove a white work van with a small magnetic sign on the door that read, Cole Maintenance Services. Nothing flashy. Nothing that needed to be. He had run building maintenance for a mid-sized commercial property for nearly a decade before everything fell apart. The details of that collapse weren't something he talked about much, a family situation that unraveled faster than he could manage financial consequences that followed like a shadow. And one morning, he woke up with no job title, no safety net, and a stack of bills that didn't care about any of it. So he did what he knew how to do. He picked up a mop, called in every favor. He had assembled a small crew of reliable workers and started taking contracts. Floor cleaning, deep sanitation, post-construction, cleanup, building maintenance, runs anything that needed doing and that he could do well. Within 2 years, Cole Maintenance Services had a steady list of clients who kept calling back, not because he was the cheapest option, but because he showed up exactly when he said he would, and left the place exactly the way he'd promised. That reputation was the only thing he had built from nothing, and he protected it the way other men protected far more visible things. Sterling Tower was not the kind of client Ryan usually chased. The building stood 42 floors above the financial district, glass and steel, and the particular kind of architecture designed to make everyone inside feel important and everyone outside feel small. It was owned and operated by a real estate conglomerate whose name appeared on plaques, press releases, and charitable donation boards across the city. The kind of company that had a branding department dedicated entirely to the concept of prestige. The contract came through a referral. One of Ryan's long-standing clients had passed his name to someone inside Sterling Tower's vendor network. The timing was tight. The company was preparing for a major corporate event, a multi-floor showcase for investors and regional partners, and the building needed a full-scale cleaning operation completed within 7 days. Every floor, every common area, every surface that might catch a visitor's eye. The scope was significant, and the timeline was aggressive, but the payment was substantial enough to matter. The agreed total came to $14,200 more than Ryan typically earned from a single contract in a month. Ryan read the contract twice before signing. He asked questions, got written answers, and made sure the payment terms were clearly documented. 60% of the total upon completion, 40% within 15 business days after sign-off. He signed. Lauren Whitmore signed. The job began the following Monday. Lauren Whitmore ran the operations division of Sterling Tower, the way some people run a small military unit, with efficiency as the stated goal and control as the actual one. She was 42, sharp-featured, and moved through the building with a particular kind of authority that came not just from her title, but from years of cultivating the impression that she was never surprised by anything. Her staff respected her in the way people respect a weather system, not because they liked it, but because ignoring it had consequences. She had a reputation in the vendor community that Ryan hadn't fully registered when he took the job, the kind of reputation that didn't appear in formal reviews, but circulated quietly in group chats and parking lot conversations between contractors who had worked the building before. That Lauren was exacting was not the problem. Exacting was fine. Exacting was something a professional crew could work with. The problem, as those who had come before Ryan would have told him, was that Lauren had a pattern. She would approve the work scope, sign the contract, let the job run to completion, and then find reasons, always, reasons to dispute the final invoice. The amounts she withheld were never large enough to trigger a formal audit. They were always just small enough to make a legal fight feel more expensive than the loss itself. Ryan didn't know this yet. He found out the hard way. His crew worked 7 days straight. 3 men and 2 women, all experienced, all people Ryan had worked with long enough to trust without micromanaging. They started at the top floors and worked their way down following a cleaning protocol. Ryan had written himself a document he updated after every major job to reflect whatever the previous one had taught him. They used industrial-grade equipment, tracked their progress floor by floor, and Ryan personally photographed each completed section before they moved on. Not because he expected trouble, because he had learned years ago that documentation was the cheapest form of insurance a small contractor could carry. By the end of day 7, the building was cleaner than it had been in years. The floors reflected the overhead lights. The glass panels on the upper conference rooms were spotless. The utility corridors, which most cleaning crews treated as an afterthought, had been swept, mopped, and deodorized according to spec. Ryan walked the final floor himself, checked his photos against the current condition of each space, and sent Lauren a completion notice by email at 6:47 in the evening. She replied within the hour. She confirmed receipt. She said she would conduct her own walkthrough the following morning and process the invoice accordingly. Ryan went home and slept better than he had in weeks. The walkthrough happened the next morning. Ryan was present, as was one of his senior crew members, a man named Dale, who had been doing this kind of work for 15 years and had the kind of calm that came from knowing exactly how good he was at his job. Lauren arrived with a junior member of her operations staff, a young woman named Cassie, who carried a clipboard and wrote things down without comment. For the first 20 minutes, the walkthrough was unremarkable. Lauren moved through the floors with a professional expression, running a finger along surfaces, checking corners, peering into supply closets. She offered no feedback, positive or negative. Ryan followed at a respectful distance, saying nothing unless asked. Then something shifted. On the 14th floor, Lauren stopped in front of a stretch of baseboard in a secondary corridor and pointed at it. "This wasn't done properly," she said. Ryan looked at the baseboard. It was clean. He knew it was clean because he had photographed it himself 48 hours ago, and it had not been used since. "We cleaned that section on day 5, he said. "I have the photo documentation if you'd like to review it." Lauren didn't look at him. She made a small motion to Cassie, who wrote something on the clipboard. They moved on. By the time the walkthrough concluded, Lauren had identified 11 areas across 9 floors that she described as not meeting operational standards. Ryan had photographic documentation for every single one of them. He presented this calmly, in order, using the timestamps on his phone in the small conference room where Lauren had chosen to conduct the invoice review. She looked at the photos. She set the phone down on the table. Then she looked at Ryan with an expression that suggested she found this entire exchange mildly tedious. "The documentation doesn't change what I observed this morning," she said. "The work in those sections did not meet the standard required for a client-facing event. Those sections were completed and photographed before the event prep began," Ryan said. "Any changes to their condition after our crew left would fall outside the scope of our contract." Lauren opened the folder in front of her and slid a revised invoice across the table. The number at the bottom was $6,100, less than 44% of the $14,200 that had been agreed upon. She had cut the payment by more than half. Ryan looked at the number. He didn't pick up the paper. "This isn't what we agreed to," he said. This reflects the quality of work actually delivered, Lauren replied. If you'd like to dispute it, you're welcome to pursue the formal vendor grievance process. That typically takes 4 to 6 months. She closed her folder. Or you can accept the revised amount and we can close this out today. The implication was clear enough. She expected him to take the reduced payment and leave. Contractors like Ryan's small operations, no legal department, no leverage usually did. But what happened in the lobby that day was what people remembered. Ryan had walked out of the conference room with the revised invoice still on the table. He was heading toward the elevator when Lauren's voice followed him into the open floor. A dozen employees were present at their desks near the coffee station, moving between workstations. Lauren's voice carried in a way that made clear she wasn't concerned about any of them hearing. You actually think you deserve full payment for that garbage you call work? Ryan stopped walking. He turned around slowly. The floor had gone quiet in the way that spaces go quiet when something is happening that everyone can feel, but no one wants to acknowledge. Lauren was standing near the conference room doorway, arms crossed, looking at him with the expression of someone who had won an argument before it started. I've had interns do a more thorough job, she continued. Whatever reputation you think you have in this industry, I'd take another look at it. Several employees looked away. A few exchanged glances. Cassie stared at her clipboard. Ryan looked at Lauren for a long moment. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, took out the original contract, his copy folded in thirds, and slipped it back in. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't say anything that could later be used against him. He turned, pressed the elevator button, and when the doors opened, he stepped inside and let them close. On the drive home, Ryan went through his options, with the same methodical quiet he brought to everything else. He could file a civil claim. He had the documentation, the contract, the time-stamped photographs. A lawyer would probably tell him he had a reasonable case. But a reasonable case against a conglomerate with a legal team on retainer meant months of process, significant upfront cost, and the kind of sustained attention that could damage his ability to take new contracts in the meantime. He could contact their corporate parent. He could escalate through Sterling Tower's vendor grievance system, the one Lauren had mentioned with the casualness of someone describing a dead-end road. 4 to 6 months. For a small operation running on 30 to 60-day payment cycles, that wasn't a grievance process. That was a slow financial suffocation. Or he could do something else. He didn't decide immediately. He waited 2 days. He paid his crew out of his own reserves. They had completed the work. They had held up their end. And whatever was happening with Sterling Tower was not their problem to absorb. That payment came to just over $4,000 out of his own pocket, which left his operating account thinner than he was comfortable with. Then on the 3rd day, he sat down and wrote something. It wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. It was a short, factual account of what had happened, the contract, the scope, the completion, the documentation, the revised invoice, and the conversation in the lobby. He wrote it the way he would explain it to someone who had no prior knowledge of the situation and no reason to take his side. He included the fact that he had photographic documentation. He included the exact difference between the $14,200 agreed upon and the $6,100 he had been offered. He did not name-call. He did not speculate about Lauren's motives. He simply described in plain language what had happened to him. He posted it on a professional networking platform where contractors, vendors, and operations managers in the city occasionally shared industry experiences. It was not a wide audience. He didn't expect it to go anywhere. He posted it, set his phone down, and went back to work. What Ryan didn't fully understand yet was the weight that a quiet, specific, well-documented account could carry, not immediately, not loudly, but in the way that small stones shift the ground beneath something large over time. He had done the only thing left that cost him nothing and took nothing from anyone. He had told the truth in a place where people who worked in his world might eventually find it. He had no way of knowing who would read it. He had no way of knowing what it would set in motion. He only knew that he had worked 7 days without complaint, delivered exactly what he had agreed to deliver, been publicly humiliated in a building full of people, and been offered less than half of what he had earned. He had not gone looking for a fight, but he had stopped pretending there wasn't one. The post sat quietly for 4 days. A handful of people clicked on it. A few left brief comments, the kind of generic sympathy that surfaces and disappears without leaving a mark. Ryan checked it once, saw the numbers, and went back to his work. He hadn't posted it expecting momentum. He had posted it because doing nothing had felt like agreeing to something he didn't agree to, and this was the only form of disagreement that didn't cost him money he didn't have. Meanwhile, Sterling Tower's communications team had already moved. Within 48 hours of Ryan's post going live, a polished response appeared in the comments section under the company's official vendor relations account. The language was measured and corporate, expressing regret for any misunderstanding, affirming Sterling Tower's commitment to fair vendor partnerships, and noting that the matter had been reviewed internally and found to reflect appropriate quality-based payment adjustments as permitted under the contract terms. It was exactly the kind of response that looked reasonable to anyone who hadn't read the contract and didn't know what the words quality-based adjustment actually meant when Lauren Whitmore applied them. A few people who had initially commented on Ryan's post went quiet after that. One person deleted their comment entirely. The narrative, such as it was, appeared to be closing before it had fully opened. Then Lauren made her second move, and it was less careful than the first. She began reaching out through back channels, informal messages to operations managers at other companies, in the building's vendor network, brief phone calls to people who knew Ryan's client contacts. The message she circulated wasn't a formal complaint. It was softer than that, and more effective for being so. She described Ryan as someone who had under-delivered on a high-profile contract and then attempted to deflect accountability by posting misleading content online. She used phrases like difficult to work with and not ready for enterprise-level contracts, the kind of language that doesn't constitute slander, but functions exactly like it inside a professional network where reputation travels faster than documentation. Within 10 days of the lobby confrontation, 2 clients contacted Ryan to say they were putting their contracts on hold, pending a review of their vendor relationships. One of them was a property management firm that had been working with Ryan for nearly 3 years. The call was brief and uncomfortable, and the property manager, a man named Greg, who had always been direct, told Ryan plainly that someone had raised concerns about him through a mutual contact. Greg didn't name the source. He didn't need to. Ryan understood the geometry of what was happening. He kept working. There wasn't much else to do. The post was still up. Ryan hadn't taken it down, hadn't edited it, hadn't added anything inflammatory. It simply sat there, accurate and unretracted, while the world around it appeared to be moving on. What Ryan couldn't see was who was reading it. A man named Patrick had worked in Sterling Tower's facilities coordination department for 6 years before leaving the previous spring. He had left quietly without drama, accepting a smaller role at a less prestigious firm because it meant working for people who treated the building staff like professionals rather than variables to be managed downward. Patrick had his reasons for leaving, and most of them had Lauren's name attached to them. He came across Ryan's post not through any algorithm or referral, but because a former colleague had forwarded it with a single line of commentary, "Sound familiar?" It did. Patrick read the post twice. He sat with it for a day. He thought about the 4 contractors he had personally watched go through invoice disputes under Lauren's direction. Disputes that followed the same structure every time, that targeted the same kinds of documentation gaps, and that always ended with the contractor accepting less than they were owed because the alternative cost more than the difference. He thought about the conversation he'd had with the senior manager before he resigned, the one where he raised the pattern and was told that vendor payment decisions were at the discretion of the operations head and that he should focus on his own responsibilities. Then he left a comment, not anonymous, not vague, under his own name, and with his former job title listed in his profile. He wrote that during his time at Sterling Tower, he had personally witnessed Lauren Whitmore dispute the invoices of at least 4 separate contractors in situations where the completed work clearly met the agreed-upon standard. He wrote that in each case, the reduction in payment was framed as a quality issue, but functioned in practice as a way to return unspent vendor budget to the operations department's bottom line, which reflected directly on Lauren's performance metrics, and by extension, her compensation. He wrote that he had raised this internally before leaving, and had been told that vendor payment disputes were at the discretion of the operations head. He kept his comment factual, specific, and attributed to himself. Then he closed his laptop and went about his evening. By the next morning, the comment had more engagement than the original post. Within 48 hours, 3 other people had added their own accounts. A former cleaning supervisor who had contracted with Sterling Tower 2 years prior described an almost identical walkthrough process in which areas she had documented as complete were flagged as deficient without any counter-documentation provided. A small electrical maintenance firm whose owner, a man named Steve, who ran a 10-person operation out of a warehouse on the east side of the city, described an invoice dispute involving a different floor of the same building settled at 63% of the agreed amount after he calculated that pursuing it legally would cost more than the difference. A former Sterling Tower employee, not a contractor, but a salaried staff member from the procurement team, confirmed that the pattern Patrick had described was not accidental and not isolated, and that it had been visible from inside the company for longer than anyone had officially acknowledged. The conversation was shifting in a way that Lauren's communications team had not anticipated, because this was no longer a dispute between a small contractor and a large company. It had become something that the company's polished corporate response could not easily address, a pattern documented across multiple voices, across multiple incidents, over multiple years. The framing had moved. This was no longer about whether Ryan Cole's crew had cleaned the 14th floor correctly. It was about whether Sterling Tower had a structural practice of exploiting small vendors, and whether the person running that practice had been doing it long enough that multiple independent witnesses could describe it in matching detail. Lauren saw the comment thread on a Wednesday morning, roughly 2.5 weeks after Ryan had first posted. Her assistant, a calm and efficient young man named Trevor, forwarded it to her with a subject line that read simply, "Escalating thought you should see this." She read it once and made 3 calls before 9 in the morning. The first call was to Sterling Tower's communications director, instructing her to prepare a more detailed response addressing the specific claims in Patrick's comment. The second was to the company's legal department, asking about options for addressing defamatory statements made by former employees on public platforms. The third was to Trevor, telling him to flag any current staff members who had liked, shared, or commented on any version of the original post or its follow-on discussion. Then she sent a message through internal channels to her current department staff. The message reminded them that discussing internal operations or vendor relationships on public platforms was a violation of their employment agreements and could result in disciplinary action. The message did not name Ryan Cole or Patrick by name. It didn't need to. One employee forwarded the message to a former colleague who had already left the company. That former colleague posted its screenshot, unedited, in a local business professionals group with a caption that read, "This is what damage control looks like from the inside." The screenshot spread faster than anything Lauren's team had prepared. 3 weeks after Ryan's original post, he received an email from a representative of Sterling Tower's Legal and Vendor Relations Department. The email was professional in tone and specific in its offer. Sterling Tower was prepared to issue the remaining payment in full, the $8,100 that had been withheld following the invoice dispute, in exchange for Ryan's agreement to remove his post from the public platform and sign a standard non-disclosure agreement covering the terms of the resolution. Ryan read the email twice. He forwarded it to a friend of his, a man named Marcus, who had worked in contract law before moving into real estate, and asked for an informal read. Marcus called him back within the hour. "They're offering you the money you were already owed," Marcus said. "In exchange for your silence. That's not a settlement. That's a cleanup operation." Ryan asked what he thought the right move was. Marcus told him that was Ryan's call to make, not his, but that signing an NDA at this stage would effectively prevent Ryan from confirming or denying anything about the situation going forward, including to other contractors who might contact him asking whether Sterling Tower was a trustworthy client. Ryan thanked him and ended the call. He sat in his van for a while in the parking lot of a hardware store where he had just picked up supplies for his next job. The offer on the table was the money. It was exactly the money he had already earned and already needed. Accepting it would resolve the financial pressure immediately and let him move forward without the distraction of a public dispute attached to his name. He drafted a reply, read it back, and deleted it. Then he wrote a second one. He declined the offer. The response from Sterling Tower came quickly and took a form Ryan had not fully anticipated. Within days of his refusal, his name appeared on a shared vendor exclusion list that circulated among several of Sterling Tower's affiliated property partners. The list was framed as an internal quality control measure, a registry of vendors who had failed to meet performance standards on previous contracts. It was not publicly posted. It didn't need to be publicly posted to be effective. The companies that received it were ones Ryan had either worked with, was currently in conversations with, or had been hoping to approach. The effect was immediate and precise. His last active contract, a quarterly maintenance agreement with a mid-rise office building 3 blocks from Sterling Tower, was terminated with 30 days' notice. The building manager, a woman named Sandra, who had always been pleasant in their dealings, delivered the news by phone and sounded genuinely uncomfortable doing it. She didn't offer an explanation beyond a change in our vendor alignment strategy, which was a phrase that meant nothing and communicated everything. By the end of that week, Ryan Cole had no active contracts. His crew had no scheduled work. His bank account, already reduced from paying his team out of pocket after the Sterling Tower job, was now approaching a number that made the next month look uncertain and the month after that look worse. Lauren Whitmore, from what Ryan could piece together through the professional network he still had access to, had publicly characterized the situation as resolved. She had framed Ryan's refusal to accept the settlement as evidence of bad faith on his part, and had presented the vendor exclusion action as a routine quality assurance measure entirely unrelated to the public dispute. Inside Sterling Tower's walls, the story was apparently that the contractor had been managed out appropriately, and the matter was closed. Ryan sat at the small desk in the corner of his apartment, where he did his invoicing and scheduling, and looked at a calendar that had almost nothing on it. The work that had taken him 2 years to build had been dismantled in a matter of weeks, not by anything he had done wrong, but by the concentrated effort of an organization that had the infrastructure to make a person's professional reputation disappear without ever having to prove a single thing against them. He thought about Patrick, who had put his name on a public comment with no obligation to do so, and no obvious benefit to himself. He thought about Steve, the electrical contractor, who had written 3 paragraphs about an invoice dispute that had cost him money 2 years ago and that he had clearly never stopped thinking about. He thought about the former procurement employee who had confirmed the pattern from inside, knowing that Sterling Tower would know exactly who had posted it. None of those people had anything obvious to gain. They had simply decided that the truth was worth the cost of saying it. Ryan was not a man given to dramatic declarations. He didn't think in terms of missions or movements. He was a person who cleaned buildings for a living and was good at it, and he had been cheated out of money he had worked a 7-day week to earn. But sitting in that apartment with an empty calendar and a depleted account, he understood something that had not been entirely clear before. Lauren had not just tried to take his money. She had tried to make the act of telling the truth about it too expensive to sustain. He had declined her offer, He was still standing barely in a landscape she had deliberately made difficult, and the post was still up. Lauren Whitmore had been wrong about one thing, and it turned out to be the thing that mattered most. She had assumed that silencing the contractors would silence the story. It was a reasonable assumption, based on how these situations had resolved, before apply enough pressure, remove enough income, and people who couldn't afford a prolonged fight would eventually choose survival over principle. She had done it before. The pattern Patrick had described in his comment was real, and it had worked every time preceding this one, because every time preceding this one, the person on the other end had taken the money and signed the paper and disappeared. What she had not accounted for was the interior of Sterling Tower itself. The internal message she had sent the one reminding staff that discussing vendor relationships on public platforms violated their employment agreements had not landed the way she intended. She had meant it as a boundary. Her staff had read it as a confession. There is a specific kind of message that organizations send when they are frightened, and experienced employees recognize it immediately, not by what it says, but by when it arrives. This one arrived 3 days after a public comment thread had begun documenting a pattern of misconduct with her name attached to it. The timing was not subtle. Over the following 2 weeks, something shifted inside the building that no communication strategy could address because it wasn't happening in public. It was happening in break rooms and stairwells and in the kind of brief hallway exchanges that don't get recorded anywhere. People who had worked under Lauren for years and had stayed quiet about what they had witnessed were now having conversations they hadn't had before. Not because Ryan Cole's post had told them anything they didn't know, most of them already knew it, but because seeing it written down by an outsider, confirmed by a former colleague, and then met with a threatening internal memo, had made the thing real in a way that years of quiet awareness had not. 3 people submitted internal complaints to Sterling Tower's HR department within a 10-day window. The complaints were separate, filed by individuals who did not coordinate with one another, and they described different incidents across different time frames. But they shared a common thread: Lauren's management style, the pressure she applied to staff who raised concerns, and the specific practice of manipulating vendor invoices to improve departmental budget metrics. One complaint came from a project coordinator who had been in the room during 2 separate invoice disputes and had been instructed by Lauren afterward not to discuss the outcomes with anyone outside the department. Another came from a senior facilities associate who had flagged an unusually large payment reduction to Lauren directly and been told to update the budget records and move on. HR logged all 3. Company policy required them to. Outside the building, the situation was developing along a separate track that Lauren had even less ability to control. Employment review platforms, the kind where current and former employees left anonymous assessments of their workplaces, had begun collecting entries about Sterling Tower at a rate that the company's talent acquisition team found difficult to ignore. The reviews were not coordinated. They were simply people who had worked there or who had left recently describing what the environment had actually felt like. Words that appeared with frequency included retaliatory, exhausting, and one phrase that showed up in multiple independent submissions: you learn quickly that speaking up costs more than staying quiet. The talent acquisition team was in the middle of a significant hiring push. Sterling Tower had several departments expanding ahead of a projected growth period, and the team had been conducting first-round interviews for dozens of positions over the past month. The drop-off rate candidates who accepted an interview invitation and then withdrew before the scheduled date had been climbing in a way that had no obvious explanation in early October, but became considerably easier to explain by early November. Recruiters were finding that candidates who researched the company were finding the review platform entries before they found the company's carefully maintained careers page. 2 candidates who had been considered strong prospects for senior roles sent brief withdrawal emails within the same week. Neither cited a specific reason. One noted only that she had decided to pursue other opportunities. The other didn't explain at all. The talent acquisition director, a thorough man named Howard, who took the metrics of his department, seriously pulled the data, and found that the withdrawal rate had nearly doubled over a 6-week period. He wrote a memo. The memo went to the executive team. The contractors noticed the shift first because they were watching most carefully. Steve, the owner of the electrical maintenance firm who had shared his own invoice dispute story in the comment thread, had by this point become an informal reference point for other small vendors considering work with Sterling Tower. The calls he received were the kind that happened quietly, one contractor reaching out to another before signing anything, the due diligence check, that didn't appear in any formal process, but was how the vendor community actually functioned. Steve's answer each time was consistent. He described his own experience with Sterling Tower's invoice dispute process, kept the account factual, and said plainly that he would not be pursuing further contracts with the building until there was a change in how its operations department handled vendor payments. He wasn't running a campaign. He was simply telling the truth to people who asked. Within a month of Ryan's post, first appearing Sterling Tower's facilities director, a man named Arthur, who had been with the company for 11 years and who had always operated several layers removed from Lauren's vendor dealings, found himself unable to fill 3 urgent maintenance contracts that should have been straightforward. 2 established firms passed without explanation. A third responded to the initial inquiry and then went quiet. Arthur made calls, asked around, and eventually got an honest answer from a contact at a property management firm across town, who told him without enjoying the telling that Sterling Tower's reputation in the vendor community had taken a serious hit, and that the problem appeared to originate with a specific incident in the operations department. Arthur brought this to the executive team in the same meeting where Howard presented his recruitment memo. The 2 problems presented side by side made a case that neither would have made independently. The internal investigation was authorized by the end of that week. It was conducted by an outside firm, a corporate governance consultancy that Sterling Tower's board had used twice before for unrelated compliance reviews. The scope was defined broadly enough to cover vendor payment practices across the operations department over a 3-year period. The investigators interviewed current staff, requested financial records, and reviewed the internal complaint files that HR had been holding since the 3 submissions arrived. They also reviewed the communications records that Lauren had sent through internal channels during the period following Ryan's post, including the message to her department about public platform discussions, a message that, reviewed in this context, read less like a policy reminder and more like an attempt to suppress witness accounts. What they found, documented across spreadsheets and payment records and internal budget reports, was a practice that had been running with Lauren's knowledge and direction for at least 2.5 years. The pattern was consistent. Contractors who completed work within spec would receive a post-completion walkthrough, have deficiencies identified in areas where the documentation was weakest, and receive a revised invoice that reduced the payment by amounts ranging from 20% to nearly 60% of the agreed total. The recovered funds were logged as budget savings within Lauren's department, which contributed to performance metrics that influenced her annual compensation review. In 2.5 years, the practice had been applied to more than a dozen vendors, and the total amount withheld across those disputes ran into the low 6 figures. The practice had never been flagged internally because the amounts involved in any single incident were small enough to fall below the threshold that would trigger a formal audit. Taken individually, each dispute looked like a legitimate quality control decision made by a department head acting within her authority. Taken together across 2.5 years and more than a dozen vendors, it was something else entirely. The investigators presented their findings to the executive team on a Thursday morning. Lauren was placed on administrative leave that afternoon. Her termination was finalized by the end of the following week. Sterling Tower's response came in 2 parts. The first was a public statement released through the company's official communications channels, acknowledging that an internal review had identified practices within the operations department that did not reflect the company's standards for vendor relations. The statement expressed regret to any contractors whose payment agreements had been handled improperly and committed to a review of all disputed invoices from the relevant period. It didn't name Lauren. It did not describe the specifics of what had been found. It was careful in the way that corporate public statements are always careful, but it was real in the sense that it conceded something which was more than Sterling Tower's communications team had been willing to do at any point in the preceding 2 months. The second part was a direct communication to Ryan Cole. A letter arrived physical mail, which surprised him from Sterling Tower's executive office. It was signed by the company's chief operating officer, a man named Gerald, whose name Ryan had seen on the building's corporate directory, but had never interacted with. The letter acknowledged the specific incident involving Ryan's contract, confirmed that the invoice reduction had been improper, and stated that the full outstanding balance of $8,100 would be transferred to Ryan's account within 5 business days. It also contained 3 sentences that Ryan read twice before setting the letter down on his desk. They expressed in plain language without legal hedging that the company was sorry for what had happened, not just for the payment dispute, but for the way Ryan had been spoken to in the lobby in front of his colleagues. The money arrived in 4 business days. Ryan sat with the letter for a long time after the payment cleared. He had spent the better part of 2 months working reduced hours, living carefully, watching a client list he had built over years contract down to almost nothing. He had paid his crew out of his own pocket when he had the money to do it, and asked them to bear with him when he didn't. Dale, his senior crew member, had not left. Neither had the others. They had stayed because they trusted him, and because they had watched what had happened, and understood that the situation was not a reflection of Ryan's competence or reliability. That loyalty had cost them real income during weeks when the schedule was nearly empty, and he knew it, and he intended to make it right. The work was already starting to come back. In the week following Sterling Tower's public statement, Ryan received 4 inquiries, 2 from companies he had never worked with before, 1 from a property management firm that had put its contract with him on hold 2 months earlier, and 1 from Greg, the manager at the firm that had been his longest-standing client before Lauren's back-channel campaign had reached him. Greg's call was brief and direct in the way Greg's calls always were. He said he had followed the situation, that he understood now what had actually happened, and that he wanted to restart their contract if Ryan was still interested. Ryan said he was still interested. In the weeks that followed, something happened that Ryan had not anticipated and had not been working toward. Several former Sterling Tower employees, people who had left the company over the past year, some of whom had commented on the original post, and some of whom Ryan had never interacted with, reached out to him individually, not to ask for anything, but to tell him what his decision to keep the post up had meant to them. One woman named Diane, who had worked in Sterling Tower's project coordination department for 4 years before resigning, told him that she had been trying to find language for what the environment inside that building had felt like for a long time, and that reading a straightforward account of it from the outside had helped her name it in a way she could use. She was applying for jobs again. She wanted him to know that. Ryan didn't know what to say to that, which was unusual for him, so he kept it simple. He told her he hoped she found something good. A few of those former employees were still looking for work in overlapping industries, and Ryan did what he could, passed names to contacts who were hiring, made a few calls on behalf of people he had never met in person, but whose accounts of their time at Sterling Tower he found credible. He didn't announce that he was doing this. It wasn't a gesture intended to be seen. It was just the thing that made sense to do when you had a small network and someone needed access to it. A year after the lobby confrontation, Cole Maintenance Services had more active contracts than it had carried at any point in its existence. Ryan had hired 2 additional crew members and was in the process of formalizing a tiered service structure that would allow him to bid on larger commercial properties without overextending his team. His documentation protocols, the time-stamped photographs, the pre- and post-completion records, The signed acknowledgement forms he now required at the start of every job had become something he actively described to new clients as part of his service standard. Most of them found it reassuring. A few asked him why he was so thorough about it. He told them it was just how he worked. He didn't usually elaborate beyond that. At a local business networking event held in the atrium of a downtown hotel, Ryan arrived slightly late and found a table near the back where the coffee was. He recognized two people at the table before he sat down, a man named Kevin, who had been in Sterling Towers' facilities department and had left 6 months after the investigation concluded, and Diane, the woman from project coordination, who had sent him the message about finding language for what she had experienced. They were both employed again. Kevin had moved to a smaller property management firm and said the difference in atmosphere was significant enough that he had stopped dreading Monday mornings. Diane had taken a role at a nonprofit and seemed from the brief conversation they had over bad coffee and a plate of pastries that nobody was really eating to be doing well. They thanked him. He accepted the thanks without deflecting it, because deflecting it would have been its own kind of dishonesty, a way of pretending the whole thing had been effortless or inevitable when it had been neither. But he told them what was true, which was that he hadn't been trying to dismantle anything or expose anyone. He had done work he was proud of, been cheated out of payment for, had been humiliated in front of a room full of people, and decided that the accurate account of those events was worth more than the settlement offer designed to erase it. That was all he had done. The rest had happened because other people had decided independently and at their own cost that the truth was something worth adding their names to. He drove home that night in the same white van with the same magnetic sign on the door. The calendar on his phone had work scheduled through the end of the following month. His crew knew what they were doing. His clients knew what they were getting. And the reputation he had built, the slow, unglamorous, one handshake at a time reputation that Lauren Whitmore had tried to dismantle, was more solid now than it had ever been. Not because he had fought for it in any dramatic sense, but because when the moment came to let it go cheaply, he had decided it was worth keeping.